Giorgia Meloni could have a role in that.
The Trump whisperer kind of thing.
I think she can be the Trump whisperer to some extent. I mean, she is good friends with Elon Musk. Elon Musk is present at Mar-a-Lago, I think even today. I mean, he's just hovering around the place. He's been in calls with world leaders like Volodymyr Zelensky.
Oh, obviously, there's Viktor Orban as well, who Trump has talked about in glowing terms throughout his campaign. Would that mean they would gain power here in Europe? Hello, this is the Brussels Signal Studio, and my name is Justin Stairs. We're here to talk about relations between the EU and the US under the coming Donald Trump presidency, relations between Washington and Brussels, where we are based. I have a studio guest. Thanks a lot for coming, Craig Willy. Now, Craig is a political consultant and also a writer about politics. He's on Substack. You can find him under Evo Politics, where he writes not just about politics, but also about biotech and population trends. Hello, Craig.
Hello, great to be here.
Now, obviously, when we looked forward to January and Donald Trump, most people are not looking forward to January here in Brussels. But one of the things that I know that you have written about, and we talked about briefly before we started, was the coming culture clash between Washington and Brussels. So how do you think this dynamic will play out?
Well, it's very hard to predict, but we can already say a few things. Partly based on Trump's previous presidency. So we already have a taste of his management style and how he does things and how it does clash with a lot of international organizations and the expectations of some European partners. And this culture clash is even societal because we see that they did polling of different European countries of who would you vote for, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump? And in the overwhelming majority of European countries, most people overwhelmingly supported Kamala Harris, especially in the northern and western countries like Denmark and France. The more you go into Eastern Europe, the more it gets a bit complicated and that there's more support for Trump, but still, in general, favorable to Harris. So Europeans in general, and I base this on conversations I have with Europeans, don't always understand the appeal of Donald Trump at all, and they don't see why anybody would vote for him. And so that is a real clash with the 50% of Americans, the popular vote majority voting for Donald Trump. And there's also an institutional clash because we have seen one thing is Trump's style is basically transactional, that he's about deals. He's always talking about deals. He's always about the spectacle. He's about creating tension. And personal relationships. And this is completely different from this very complex, to some extent Baroque system that the EU has created to try to find consensus between 27 different countries. And so it tends to be institutional, legal, technocratic, completely different from the Trump style.
Right. Now, how is that going to play out? I mean, to start with, there is always this question, isn't there, when the US wants to phone Europe, who does the US president call? Is he going to call anyone, or is he going to do bilateral deals with the 27 member states, do you think?
I think bilateral deals will definitely continue. And in fact, we've always had them. So, for example, when countries want to get new defense equipment, they often don't do multinational European partnerships, but say the Romanians or the Poles might do a deal with the U.S. to get the equipment that they need. And there are strong incentives for individual countries to have good relations with the U.S. But that has been a bit of a puzzle for me of how should Brussels policymakers try to engage the blonde beast, let's say. And I think the best idea I've heard, I think it's from Klaus Welle, the former, I believe he's Secretary General of the Parliament in the past, who said Giorgia Meloni could have a role in that.
Okay.
Because I do think you need a person.
The Trump whisperer kind of thing.
I think she can be the Trump whisperer to some extent. I mean, she is good friends with Elon Musk. Elon Musk is present at Mar-a-Lago, I think even today. I mean, he's just hovering around the place. He's been in calls with world leaders like Volodymyr Zelensky. So having that relationship, having someone who can vouch for you and say, hey, can you soft pedal it a bit? Can you hold the pressure a little bit? I think that can go a long way.
And what would this mean then for Prime Minister Meloni? I mean, if she could set herself up, obviously there's Viktor Orban as well, who Trump has talked about in glowing terms throughout his campaign. If one or either of these politicians could set themselves up as some kind of intermediary, would that mean they would gain power here in Europe?
Well, I think it would be a strong incentive to continue the normalization of these national populist parties. So not so much Viktor Orban, I would say, because he's really more seen as a black sheep. But we have seen Commission President Ursula von der Leyen try to gain the support of Giorgia Meloni and of the ECR to some extent, saying, I'll be willing to work with them to the extent that they are democratic, to the extent that they support Ukraine. I'm willing to collaborate with them. And I think that's a part of the democratic process. So if then Giorgia Meloni becomes a critical node between Brussels and the Trump White House, I mean, that will definitely strengthen her position.
Would it be a strong enough position to undo some of these coming tariffs, though? Obviously, one thing that Trump has said, he's going to slap tariffs on almost everyone. The French are very worried about their wine exports and their cheese exports. Is this going to be a subject of negotiation, do you think, or is this inevitable?
I think a lot depends on the details, because Trump won with very simple messages. So tariffs to protect workers, drill, baby, drill, tax cuts, mass deportations. So all those are great as slogans. They resonate. They're simple. But what do they mean in practice? And that can mean a lot of different things. So I think it's open. I don't think Trump has a plan. That is to say that, and he has said this, if you read the first 2 pages of The Art of the Deal, which is his book from the 1980s, I swear, I finally understood the first Trump presidency.
Okay.
We'd been covering it for years. People had been following it. People had been shouting, screaming. But first 2 pages, he says, I don't have a briefcase. I go to the office. I do 50 calls. I have 20 meetings. I just see how things develop. That's good for creativity. And that's how he does things.
He's an improviser.
He's absolutely an improviser, and he's by the seat of his pants. And it's worked for him. You have to admit it. It has worked for him. But so that's why I think you have to be open, because I don't think he has a fixed plan.
Do we have any more detail now that he's made his first appointments? I've got a little list here, just picked out 1 or 2. Scott Bessent, Treasury Secretary, Brendan Carr at the FCC, Marco Rubio, Secretary of State. In his case, in particular, he is renowned for being tough on Iran and China. Do these appointments give us any more clues?
Well, most of the names you cited, I would say, are within the normal range of the Republican Party. So this would suggest that he wants to have a normal Republican administration. And the big change this time, as opposed to 2016, is that he has the party behind him. So we all remember after the assassination attempt against him, which clipped his ear and was followed by the Republican National Convention, there was a huge moment of unity for Republicans. So the party really is behind him in a way which it wasn't in 2016. But he also has all the other nominees. So people like RFK Jr.,
yes,
like Tulsi Gabbard, like Matthew Gaetz, who has withdrawn, which suggests that he will not be a normal, quote-unquote, normal president. So it's hard to say at this stage. I think he will have the normal Republicans as part of his coalition, but there are a lot of underdetermined aspects. So Tulsi Gabbard, for example, she's the opposite of Marco Rubio. She's the opposite. I mean, some people call her an apologist. I wouldn't call her necessarily an apologist, but she's very critical of American interventionism, of American wars, and she thinks America has been responsible for a lot of conflicts in the Middle East, which I think is actually, there is some truth to that, and in other regions. So, but how do you square her with Marco Rubio? That'll be very interesting to see.
Right, now you've touched on isolationism, haven't you? Now, if that happens, it wouldn't be a surprise, I guess, because this has been a consistent theme for Trump. Why are we getting ourselves, he says, involved in these wars that have nothing to do with the US? And I guess that leads on, doesn't it, to Ukraine and his promise to put an end to the war. I mean, since that promise has made, there's been an awful lot of speculation as to what he could do. What can one president do? What's your opinion on that subject?
I think it's one of the other aspects which is very unclear going forward for two reasons. So, one, we don't know what Trump will want exactly. And two, and foreign policy in particular, we don't know what he'll be able to do. Because we saw very well in the first presidency that he was not really in charge of foreign policy, that there was a huge amount of infighting in his team with absolutely contradictory tendencies. I think he's probably better equipped this time, so he'll probably have more of a grip on what is going on. On the other hand, I doubt he has very strong personal views. So I'm sure he'll be very pro-Israel. I'm sure he'll be very anti-Iran. I'm sure he'll put tariffs. I'm sure he'll make energy easier. But what he'll do on Ukraine, it takes two to tango. So it will also depend on what Vladimir Putin wants. And we've never asked Vladimir Putin. We've always been operating on the assumption that Ukraine must be whole, that its territorial integrity must not be affected, and therefore we don't know how much Putin really wants to push for. I'm sure ideally he would want all of Ukraine, but the most likely scenario, I think, will be a frozen conflict where at a certain point we say, let's do a ceasefire. We're not going to recognize the changes. The Russian-occupied areas will be de facto part of Russia. But again, that's because we've had a lot of people die, and now the Ukrainians are really struggling to draft people. I mean, people leaving the country, and you've seen also change in Ukrainian public opinion. Up till last year, Ukrainians did not want to stop fighting. They wanted to continue to fight to liberate their whole country. But at this stage, I think it's an opening. So I think a lot depends on Putin, and a lot will depend on Trump.
And Europe will only have a small say, I guess, in what goes on. I mean, we've had these statements of support from the UK and France, who are unwilling, it would seem, to let Ukraine down. But maybe it's not up to them. I don't know.
Well, I think it depends how much aid you give. The Ukrainians can fight as long as they're willing to fight, but the others will give as long as they're willing to give. And we did see Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor of Germany, have a call with Putin and say, hey, you should be exploring peace talks. And Volodymyr Zelensky criticized Scholz for that. Right. Make of that what you will, but right now the U.S. is by far the biggest donor. I mean, it's something like $90 billion a year, so that gives you a lot of heft.
And I guess, obviously, the outgoing Biden administration is another factor, isn't it? To what extent are they going to... some are accusing them of wanting to kick off World War III even. I mean, but irrespective of whether that's true or false, let's presume it's false, that they are nevertheless willing to increase aid, it would seem. We've had, the green light for the use of new types of missiles in Ukraine. So they are a player in this as well.
There has been an escalation, so the use of U.S. weapons to hit deeper into Russia. Some people have asked, why were they not allowed to use this earlier? I mean, after all, Russia strikes all parts of Ukraine. Why shouldn't Ukraine reciprocate? It's a somewhat frightening dynamic. I mean, Russia has retaliated with an intercontinental ballistic missile that hit Ukraine. Didn't have much. It was mostly symbolic, let's say. It was not a nuclear missile. But nonetheless, it opens the question of, will we be able to de-escalate? So the outgoing Biden administration in some ways is escalating now. I think they want to support Ukraine as much as they can while they still can. Maybe it will give scope for Trump to be the good cop, quote unquote. It's hard to say.
Has he said anything? I've been looking for quotes by Trump about this escalation, but I haven't seen many. Have you?
So his son, Don Jr., was highly critical. And Don Jr. was, I believe, denouncing the military-industrial complex and that kind of rhetoric. So you can see that a part of Trump world is now on board with this anti-interventionist narrative, which originally was more of a left-wing. Well, it depends how far back you go. I mean, in the 30s, it was a right-wing thing, but in the 2000s under Bush, this was very much of a left-wing narrative, that we have this military-industrial complex, that we have wars for the sake of these big businesses, this sort of self-perpetuating national security state. And Don Jr. was giving voice to that. So I don't know if Don Jr. I don't know what that voice is worth in Trump world, but it's significant.
Okay. Now, obviously, there are many other possible changes in the transatlantic relationship. I'm wondering if you're an investor, and if so, which way is the dollar going to go? I mean, there's been a bit of an upswing, hasn't there?
I would be bullish on the American economy. So I'm not going to speak about the dollar in particular because I really don't know what accounts for monetary swings. Um, it will normally depreciate insofar as Trump has promised a deficit agenda. So, his friend Elon Musk has said we're going to get rid of budget deficits and it's going to be fantastic. That is extremely difficult because you have locked in entitlement spending of Medicare, Social Security, which is just going to grow over the years, and we want tax cuts. So if you want those two things, and you want to help Ukraine, and you want to do all these things, you're going to have huge deficits. Now, deficits can encourage growth, especially something notable in the U.S. and you saw in the first Trump term. You also had tax cuts and deficits, but that facilitates investment. That means that people who have money, who have profits, make more profits, and are able to reinvest more. And you're going to have a huge deregulatory agenda. You're going to have cheaper energy, and you're going to have a technophile agenda. Because, I mean, one thing with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy and Peter Thiel, who was Trump's backer back in 2016, is that they are all techno-optimists, and they really want to do or die, innovate. So some of those policies will have negative consequences for the environment, at least in the short term, because you're going to be having more carbon dioxide emissions. You're going to have
Fracking? Are you talking about fracking, for example?
For example, absolutely. Right? I mean, there's more fracking, and there's going to be more transportation of gas. They're going to try to make it easier for the U.S. to export gas. That's what the oil and gas industry is pushing for now. And for the economy, this will be good. I mean, this is a simple fact. And one thing which it breaks my heart, because I don't like seeing Europe fall behind. It's not something I like. But we have seen over the last 12 years a disconnect between Europe and America. You see it very well in the charts, where the growth is in America, the population growth is in America, the investment is there. We've seen the Draghi report, so this EU report on competitiveness, outlining certain measures to boost competitiveness, and that's a good shift. But really, in terms of the energy prices, it's no comparison. And all these cutting-edge sectors, I mean, AI, space, biotech, it's just dominance. So China is competitive with the U.S. in many of these things. But otherwise, Europe is really suffering. So I would be bullish for the U.S. economy. I will say that.
And what about the EU economy then? Because obviously one of the major differences, it seems to me at least, is that the U.S. And Trump and his friends are talking about deregulation. Whereas critics say that in Europe, the institutions do nothing but regulate, basically. I mean, they do talk about deregulation, but it never seems to happen. Is that fair?
Well, I think that's fair for the EU level, because the EU has limited powers. So its main powers are to do with creating the single market and then regulating that market. It doesn't have the power of the purse to an unlimited extent. It's only 1% of GDP. So their role really is to try to create markets and then regulate those markets. And they've struggled to create those markets in certain sectors, like finance, for example, with the banking union. And otherwise, once the market is created, their role is to regulate. That regulation can be good or bad. As a consultant, I can say that companies like having one authority to deal with as opposed to 27 authorities. This is a big win. On the other hand, that one authority will tend to be very consensus-based, and it will tend to be slower than a comparable national regulator. So there are pros and cons. I think in most areas, the EU regulation is not punitive. I would say that in most areas. There are some where it is.
Including AI?
I don't work on that, so I can't tell you. But one area where it is punitive is crop biotechnology, so GMOs.
Right.
So GMOs, there's now a new generation of GMOs with gene editing technology, which is a different process of modification, where the modification could have occurred naturally, essentially. The UK is moving towards making that easier to market. The US, other countries are. So that's one area where it's punitive. In most areas, I would say the EU regulation is not punitive. The problem is also at the national level, where you have huge amounts of taxes, huge amounts of debt, and you enter into these debt spirals where you have to slash to to reduce your deficit, and that reduces growth. And you have a very poorly designed Eurozone. I mean, the Eurozone is still not a very, very solid construct. And it's not looking good, I have to say. For the next 5 years at least, I'm not bullish on the European economy. I think people are trying; they're making big efforts, but it's not easy.
I guess to be fair to the regulators, one thing which which you mentioned, in fact, before we started, was that the US is now looking at food regulation and using the EU model, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So this has been one of the big talking points of the last 5 years in the EU wonk space, among policy experts, is this thing called the Brussels effect. So this is the idea that when the EU sets rules, the EU market is so big that other countries and other companies outside the EU copy those standards because they tend to be the highest standards. And so if you're good enough for the EU, you're good enough for everywhere. And that's a pretty good argument. We have to see if that is actually true for particular sectors. It's very hard to gauge that, I have found. But we have heard RFK Jr. say that the U.S. has all these awful chemicals in their food, and we need to copy the EU regulation to ban all these chemicals from American food, hundreds of chemicals. So this is a win for the EU as a regulatory power.
Go Brussels. Go Brussels. Okay. Right. And where do you sit or stand on the free speech issue, Craig? I mean, because this is also... It seems to divide the US and the EU in that here, lots of people, there is a growing mass of regulation in the social media area, for example, whereas in the US, they're talking about going in the other direction. Where do you sit?
I am pro-free speech, so I believe that anything which is not an imminent threat should be legal. It's very hard to decide when you should be banning things. So hate speech is a concept, but it's a slippery one. Disinformation is a concept, but that's a very slippery one. And I think a lot of trust was lost during the pandemic. I think the fact that now you can say maybe it came from a Chinese lab, but you couldn't say that 2 years ago.
Could you?
You would be banned off social media. You would be banned from Facebook. I think that's a huge problem. And you also saw it, and this is part of Trump's revenge, so to speak, was that part of the reason he lost in 2020 is that the big tech companies ganged up on him and, for example, banned all reporting on the Hunter Biden laptop story, where it had compromising information on Joe Biden's son and his habits and his links with foreign governments, and did he provide access to them in exchange for favors. And the New York Post was banned from social media because they reported this factual story. And the usual suspects said, this is Russian disinformation, etc. But that you lose a lot of trust. So I'm pro-free speech. There's a big culture clash there between the U.S. and the EU. The U.S. really is the only country with a very strong commitment to almost absolute free speech in the world. And this goes back to, I think, 1920s or so, when you had this jurisprudence starting to build up. Because it wasn't the case before, for example. Before that, state governments could regulate speech. But that free speech commitment in the First Amendment got stronger and stronger. Europe has never had such a strong commitment on those things. They've always thought that we should suppress certain forms of speech, like hate speech or Holocaust denial.
Or speech that goes against the government line, maybe. Just a joke.
It's a slippery slope. It's definitely a slippery slope.
Yeah.
But we also see that it's also subcultural. So what I mean by that is liberals, metropolitan liberals in America, actually often have kind of European, agree with the Europeans that there should be more controlling of what happens on social media. And Tim Walz, so Kamala Harris's vice presidential nominee, said you can't have hate speech. You have to ban hate speech. So the Democrats wanted to go in the more European direction.
Right. Okay, I'm just wondering, all this, the suppression of factual stories that you've just referred to there, could it happen here? Is it happening here? What do you think?
Well, I don't want to talk too much about it, but it did happen during the pandemic to some extent. So it is something that happens. But every country has its balance. Every country chooses, and in the EU, we have this legislation which has built it up. I do think that EU legislation has to be respected to the extent that it's the consensus of 27 countries, or at least a supermajority of those countries. So whatever they put together, it has to be something which is, there's a reason they put it there. That doesn't mean it's perfectly worded. Doesn't mean that the legislations have problems, but we have to take the concerns seriously.
Okay. So, what do you think to the way the EU is moving now? I mean, I ask because you're a consultant. You follow these things in the Parliament, for example. There's a talk about a shift towards the right and new majorities. Is Europe moving towards the right?
It has been moving towards the right for years, so at least for, I would say, a decade and a half, where you see the right-wing parties getting more and more votes. And we saw this in 2019. We saw this this year. Now we have 3 national populist blocs. I don't know how you want to define these, but there's one around the AfD, so this is the more radical one. There's one around Viktor Orban and Marine Le Pen, still considered black sheep, not really respectable. And then you have European conservatives and reformists with Giorgia Meloni, who is basically part of the governing coalition.
Right, this side of the cordon sanitaire.
Correct. So that's the key issue, is the cordon sanitaire. So I am not a fan of the cordon sanitaire. I think it is generally a terrible principle, because what it means is that you are cutting yourself off from dialogue with the opposing side, and you are essentially disenfranchising all of the voters who went for those parties. So unless it's a violent party, unless it's legitimately trying to destroy the democratic system, I don't see how you can exclude such parties. But it has been done, and it has been done for decades. Practices differ by country. So in France, the Rassemblement National has been excluded before that, Front National, for many decades. But in Italy, you have governing coalitions with the far right. Now in the Netherlands, you have a government with the Freedom Party. In Sweden, you have the Sweden Democrats supporting the government. So you see the cordon sanitaire is breaking down in more and more countries. And I mentioned France, I'll mention it again. Now they have a real mess, because the country is evenly split between leftists, liberal centrists, and nationalists. And so they've put this caretaker government under Michel Barnier, the former Brexit negotiator for the EU. And it is supported by the Rassemblement National. It only exists because the Rassemblement National is willing to support it, and the left is not willing to taint itself by supporting a centrist government, which tells you something about tolerance also, when the left is not willing to work with a centrist government. So it's breaking down, and it's an open question. I mean, we see in the EPP, they are definitely working to some extent, looking to see who they can talk to. Absolutely.
Right, yeah. And I guess for lobbyist consultants, the cordon sanitaire doesn't stop people like you talking to everyone. I mention this because on the subject of Mr. Wilders and his party, his Dutch party, I was at an industry dinner the other week, and there was one of his MEPs at the table. In fact, there were 2. And there were lobbyists, and it was perfectly obvious that they were very willing to cooperate the lobbying industry, because they're looking for votes. So they don't apply the cordon sanitaire, do they? This is an internal parliament thing, right?
So I think it depends also on every company, every organization. So it's both tactical and ethical, let's say. So some will say, I don't like this party, so I will never talk to them. And there are consultants, there are lobbyists who take that attitude. There are others who say, well, they're excluded anyway, so it's actually not much good to talk to them, because they're not going to be influencing files in detail. You might get them in the final vote, but so they will choose not to engage. So it's really a decision of the consultants, indeed, who they decide is worth targeting.
Right. Would you talk to them?
I won't say.
No, not going to reveal any trade secrets. Okay, that's great, Craig. I mean, what's your impression of the new Commission lineup under the second von der Leyen presidency?
I think they found a new structure, which is very complex, once again. So it's very hard to say how this will work in practice. I hope they'll be able to align responsibilities so they don't step on each other's toes. We are seeing that it seems they will be approving this new commission sooner rather than later. So especially the Hungarian candidate, Varhelyi, looks like he's going to be accepted as a health commissioner and animal welfare commissioner. They're doing what they can. They are diverse politically. So you have Giorgia Meloni's nominee. You have Emmanuel Macron's nominee. So they have to find a balance and find a way to work together.
Okay. Craig, I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming to the Brussels Signal studio, and please come back when we do a debate, maybe.
I would love to. Absolutely. Thank you.
And thanks very much for watching.